The greatest act of courage is sometimes opening your front door to someone the rest of the world is searching for. Rain pounded relentlessly across the empty highways of western Montana, washing over endless stretches of pine forests, open ranch land, and weathered fences that had stood against decades of harsh winters. The sky was nearly black, although it was only a little after 8 o'clock in the evening, and every flash of lightning briefly revealed the quiet outline of an aging farmhouse standing beside a modest repair garage several miles outside the small town of Ashford. Most people had already settled inside for the night, grateful for warm fireplaces and the comforting sound of rain falling safely beyond their windows. Ethan Carter was still working. At 39 years old, the white American single father had learned long ago that broken engines never checked the weather forecast before refusing to start. Beneath the bright fluorescent lights of his garage, he carefully tightened the final bolt beneath an old Ford pickup belonging to a neighboring rancher. His denim jacket rested over the back of a chair, while his plaid work shirt carried the familiar marks of another honest day's labor. The scent of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a mug that had long since turned cold. An old country song played softly from a battered radio, filling the garage with quiet familiarity instead of loneliness. Since losing his wife several years earlier, Ethan had measured his days differently. Success was no longer counted by profit or possessions, but by repaired vehicles, bedtime stories for his 8-year-old daughter Lily, and the promise that no matter how difficult life became, she would always come home to warmth, safety, and a father who never stopped trying. He switched off the hydraulic lift and reached for the light switch when 3 slow knocks echoed through the silence. Knock, knock, knock. They were not desperate. They were almost hesitant, as though the person outside feared being turned away more than facing the storm itself. Ethan frowned and walked toward the farmhouse, wiping his hands with an old shop towel before opening the front door. The wind rushed inside immediately, carrying sheets of cold rain across the wooden floor. Standing beneath the dim porch light was a woman unlike anyone he had expected to find at his door. She appeared to be around 35 years old, her long blonde hair soaked by the relentless downpour, her elegant beige wool coat drenched from head to toe. Her blue eyes held both quiet intelligence and overwhelming exhaustion, as though she had traveled much farther than the lonely county road stretching behind her. She carried no suitcase, no purse, and no umbrella. Only silence surrounded her until she finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "Please," she whispered, struggling to steady her breathing. "Do not let them find me." Ethan instinctively looked past her into the darkness. Beyond the curtain of rain, the empty road disappeared between towering pine trees where only distant flashes of lightning interrupted the night. Nothing seemed unusual, yet something in her voice carried the unmistakable weight of genuine fear. Before he could ask another question, a small pair of footsteps crossed the hallway behind him. Lily stood rubbing sleep from her eyes while holding her favorite blue knitted blanket, the one her late mother had made before she was born. She quietly looked at the stranger for several seconds, then walked forward without hesitation. "You look cold," Lily said gently as she held out the blanket with both hands. "You can use mine." The woman stared at the simple gift as though kindness itself had become something she no longer expected to receive. Her lips trembled slightly before a grateful smile finally appeared across her tired face. Ethan watched the moment in silence. Children often recognized what adults complicated with suspicion. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come inside," he said calmly. "Whatever happened before tonight can wait until morning." The woman nodded quietly and crossed the threshold into the warmth of the farmhouse. As Ethan closed the door behind her, 3 pairs of distant headlights slowly emerged through the heavy rain at the far end of the county road, their pale beams cutting across the darkness as they began moving steadily toward the lonely farmhouse where a single act of compassion had already started changing 3 lives forever. The warmth inside the farmhouse felt almost unreal after the cold rain outside. Water slowly dripped from the woman's beige coat onto the old wooden floor, while Ethan quietly hung it near the cast iron stove without asking a single unnecessary question. Lily disappeared into the hallway and returned carrying a pair of dry wool socks that were far too large, but offered them with the sincerity only a child could possess. The woman accepted them with both hands, her blue eyes lowering as if simple kindness had become more difficult to face than hardship itself. Ethan walked into the kitchen, filled a kettle with fresh well water, and placed it on the stove. Within minutes, the familiar aroma of homemade chicken soup filled the small farmhouse, blending with the scent of fresh bread that had been baked earlier that afternoon. Rain continued tapping against the windows while the wind gently shook the old porch light outside, but inside everything seemed steady, warm, and safe. The woman remained standing near the doorway, uncertain whether she truly belonged there. Ethan noticed her hesitation before setting a steaming bowl on the kitchen table. "You do not have to explain anything tonight," he said in a calm voice. "You look like you need food and rest more than questions." She hesitated for another moment before slowly taking a seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the warm ceramic bowl, allowing the rising steam to warm her face. Lily climbed into the chair across from her, smiling with complete innocence. "My dad makes the best chicken soup in Montana," she said proudly. Ethan laughed quietly without looking up from slicing fresh bread. "That is because we only have one official judge in this house." For the first time since arriving, the woman allowed herself to smile. It was small, almost cautious, but it transformed the exhaustion on her face into something unexpectedly gentle. They ate mostly in silence, interrupted only by the comforting sounds of spoons against bowls, the rain outside, and the old kitchen clock marking another ordinary evening. To Ethan, it truly was ordinary. Helping someone who needed shelter required no special reason. It was simply how his parents had raised him, and now how he hoped Lily would grow up. When dinner ended, Lily carefully folded the blue knitted blanket around the woman's shoulders. "It always helps me sleep when storms are loud," she whispered. The woman softly touched the woven fabric with remarkable care, tracing every stitch as though each thread carried a forgotten memory. "Thank you," she answered quietly. "I've not been given something this thoughtful in a very long time." Ethan led her toward the small guest room that had once belonged to visiting relatives years earlier. The room was simple, with white curtains, handmade quilts, an oak dresser, and a window overlooking the garage where rain shimmered beneath the security light. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow will still be there when we wake up." She looked at him with visible surprise. "You trust strangers very easily." Ethan smiled gently before shaking his head. "No, I trust people until they give me a reason not to." His words lingered in the quiet room long after he stepped into the hallway and softly closed the door. Alone for the first time that evening, the woman slowly sat on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. She pulled the blue blanket closer around her shoulders, breathing more deeply than she had in what felt like years. Outside the window, 3 black sport utility vehicles appeared briefly at the far end of the county road before stopping beneath a line of towering pine trees. Their headlights remained off, nearly invisible in the darkness, while inside the farmhouse Ethan switched off the downstairs lights, completely unaware that the quiet act of opening his home had already become the center of a search reaching far beyond the borders of a small Montana town. Morning arrived quietly over the Montana Valley as sunlight spilled across the pine trees and melted the last traces of rain from the gravel driveway. The farmhouse felt different, not because anything had changed, but because the silence no longer belonged to only 2 people. Ethan had already started the coffee before dawn, as he did every morning, while the familiar scent of fresh biscuits drifted from the oven. Lily hurried into the kitchen wearing her favorite blue sweater and immediately smiled when she saw the guest already awake, standing near the window with a warm mug of coffee resting between her hands. She had borrowed one of Ethan's flannel shirts while her coat dried overnight, and for the first time since arriving, the exhaustion beneath her blue eyes seemed slightly lighter. "Good morning," Lily said cheerfully. "Dad says pancakes taste better after a storm." The woman smiled gently. I believe your dad is probably right. Ethan placed a stack of pancakes on the table before sitting down with the quiet confidence of someone who had repeated this simple routine thousands of times. No one hurried through breakfast. There was laughter when Lily accidentally spilled maple syrup across her plate, and there was comfortable silence while morning sunlight slowly filled the room. After breakfast, Ethan stood, picked up his work jacket, and headed toward the garage. "You are welcome to stay here and rest," he said. "There is no rush." The woman looked toward the garage through the kitchen window before quietly asking, "Would you mind if I helped instead?" Ethan raised an eyebrow with a small smile. "Do you know anything about repairing pickup trucks?" She laughed softly. "Not nearly enough to trust me with an engine." "Then you're already smarter than half the people who say they do." A few minutes later, she stepped inside the garage, taking in the neat rows of tools, weathered workbenches, handwritten customer notes, and shelves filled with carefully labeled parts. While Ethan worked beneath a truck belonging to a local rancher, she wandered toward the small office tucked into one corner. Papers covered nearly every surface. Repair invoices were stacked in uneven piles, appointment calendars overlapped each other, and unpaid estimates rested beneath coffee cups and old receipts. She quietly rolled up the sleeves of the borrowed flannel shirt and began organizing everything without saying a word. By lunchtime, the cluttered desk had transformed into neatly arranged folders sorted by customer name, repair status, and payment records. Ethan walked into the office, carrying 2 sandwiches before stopping in surprise. "Did you do all of this?" he asked. She nodded almost apologetically. "I hope you do not mind. I thought it might save you some time." Ethan slowly looked around the room before smiling with genuine appreciation. "I have been meaning to organize this office for about 3 years." Lily laughed from the doorway. "Dad says that every Saturday." The three of them shared another quiet laugh that felt strangely natural. Later that afternoon, while Ethan finished replacing brake pads outside, the woman's expression suddenly changed as a faint vibration echoed from inside the pocket of her folded coat hanging near the office door. She stepped inside unnoticed and carefully removed a slim black phone that had remained switched off since the previous evening. The screen illuminated with dozens of missed calls, unread messages, and urgent notifications arriving one after another. She stared silently at the display for several long seconds before closing her eyes, turning the phone off once again and placing it back inside the pocket. When she returned outside, Ethan handed her a cold glass of lemonade without asking where she had gone. She accepted it with a grateful smile, realizing that in a world where everyone demanded answers, this quiet mechanic continued offering something far more valuable: the freedom to breathe before being expected to explain. The following morning settled into an easy rhythm that felt almost familiar, even though only 2 days had passed since the stranger had crossed the farmhouse porch. The air smelled of fresh pine and damp earth after the storm, while sunlight painted long golden lines across the gravel driveway leading to Ethan's garage. Customers came and went with old pickup trucks, family sedans, and well-used ranch vehicles, each greeted by Ethan with the same steady smile and firm handshake that had earned him the trust of nearly everyone in Ashford. Claire watched quietly from the office window before stepping outside to hand him the clipboard he had forgotten for the 3rd time that week. "You are very organized," Ethan said with a small grin. "I have had excellent teachers," she answered softly, though she never explained who they were. Lily spent the afternoon drawing pictures at a small wooden table near the garage entrance, occasionally asking questions about engines that made both adults laugh. Between customers, Claire noticed that Ethan remembered every person's name, every family story, and every promise he had made, even when it meant staying late to finish a repair without charging extra because someone had fallen on difficult times. There was no sign on the garage advertising kindness, yet it seemed to be the service people valued most. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, Claire helped organize the waiting area, replacing faded magazines with neatly stacked maintenance guides and arranging handwritten appointment cards in chronological order. Ethan looked around with quiet amazement. "This place has never looked this professional," he admitted. "It was already professional," Claire replied. "Now it simply reflects the care you have always put into your work. Ethan laughed gently. You have a way of making ordinary things sound important. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Perhaps they always were. Later, after the final customer drove away, the three of them carried folding chairs onto the front porch to watch the sunset spread across the Montana mountains. Lily leaned comfortably against Ethan, while Claire wrapped the familiar blue knitted blanket around her shoulders as a cool breeze drifted across the valley. The silence felt peaceful until Claire's eyes suddenly fixed on the distant county road. A black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly past the entrance to the property without turning into the driveway. A second vehicle followed several minutes later, moving just as slowly before disappearing beyond the trees. Neither vehicle stopped, yet neither appeared lost. Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket almost without realizing it. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "Friends of yours?" he asked calmly. She remained silent for several seconds before quietly answering, "I honestly do not know anymore." Ethan did not ask another question. Instead, he stood, walked inside the farmhouse, and returned carrying 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to Claire with the same quiet kindness he had shown since the night they met. "Whatever is waiting out there," he said while looking toward the fading horizon, "it can stay on the other side of this porch until you are ready." Claire lowered her eyes as emotion softened her expression. She had spent years surrounded by people who demanded explanations before offering support. Yet this man continued offering support without asking for explanations at all. The evening settled into comfortable silence, once again as crickets began singing beneath the darkening sky. Far beyond the fields, hidden among the tall pine trees, another pair of black sport utility vehicles remained parked where they could observe the farmhouse without being easily noticed. Inside those vehicles, patient eyes watched the small porch glowing beneath its single warm light, while inside the circle of that gentle light, a father, his daughter, and a weary traveler unknowingly shared the last peaceful evening before the truth would finally find its way to their quiet corner of Montana. The next morning began with crisp mountain air and a sky so clear that the snow-covered peaks on the horizon seemed close enough to touch. Ethan unlocked the garage just after 7 o'clock, as he always did, raising the old metal door while the familiar scent of motor oil and fresh sawdust greeted another day of honest work. Claire had already prepared the appointment schedule before he finished his first cup of coffee, arranging customer files with neat handwritten notes that allowed every repair to move more smoothly than ever before. Local ranchers noticed the difference almost immediately. Trucks were finished sooner, paperwork was easier to understand, and waiting times had become noticeably shorter. By noon, several customers thanked Ethan for the improvements, assuming he had finally hired someone with years of business experience. Ethan simply smiled toward Claire. Without saying much, "Looks like you have already made this place better than I ever could," he joked while wiping grease from his hands. Claire shook her head gently. "I did not make it better. I only helped people see what was already here." Ethan laughed quietly. "You always know how to say things that make me think." Throughout the afternoon, the garage remained unusually busy. Lily greeted customers with cheerful waves while finishing her homework at the small desk beside the office window. Claire answered telephone calls with calm professionalism, organized incoming repair requests, and even suggested a simple appointment system that prevented customers from waiting for hours. Ethan could not understand how someone who claimed to know almost nothing about repairing vehicles understood so much about helping a small business thrive. Every time he looked toward the office, he found Claire focused on helping someone else rather than herself. Late in the afternoon, an elderly rancher arrived, driving an aging pickup that had clearly seen decades of hard work. Ethan inspected the truck before quietly telling the man that several repairs could safely wait until next month because only one part truly needed immediate attention. The old rancher admitted that money had been tight since the previous winter, and Ethan reduced the bill without making it sound like charity. After the customer drove away, Claire watched him with thoughtful eyes. "You could have charged for everything," she said softly. Ethan shrugged, as though the answer were obvious. "He came here because he trusted me. I cannot fix a truck by breaking that trust. Claire lowered her eyes, allowing his words to settle into the silence between them. She had spent years sitting in conference rooms where every decision was measured by quarterly reports, market value, and shareholder expectations. Yet this quiet mechanic measured success by whether another family could safely drive home. As the sun began sinking behind the mountains, an unfamiliar convoy finally turned onto the gravel driveway instead of passing by. 3 black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly toward the garage before stopping in a straight line. The engines fell silent almost together. Several professionally dressed men and women stepped out, their business attire looking strangely out of place against the dusty Montana landscape. None of them appeared angry or threatening. Instead, their faces reflected relief, mixed with anxious anticipation. Claire froze where she stood, the color slowly leaving her face. Ethan looked from the visitors to Claire, sensing that the moment she had been quietly avoiding had finally arrived. One distinguished gray-haired gentleman walked forward, removed his glasses, and spoke with unmistakable respect rather than authority. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, his voice carrying across the quiet garage, "everyone has been searching for you. The board, your employees, your investors, and thousands of families who depend on your company have been hoping you were safe." Ethan turned slowly toward Claire. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again, no longer able to hide behind silence. "My name is Claire Whitmore," she said softly. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Global Industries." The garage became completely still. Even the gentle Montana breeze seemed to pause. Ethan looked at the woman who had shared homemade soup, folded repair invoices, laughed with Lily, and worn his old flannel shirt, then smiled with the same quiet warmth he had shown on the night she first knocked on his door. "Well," he said calmly, "that certainly explains why you organize paperwork a whole lot better than I ever did." No one spoke for several long seconds after Claire's quiet confession. The visitors waited respectfully near the garage entrance, allowing the silence to settle naturally instead of rushing to fill it with explanations. Ethan leaned against the workbench, folded the shop towel in his hands, and looked at Claire with the same calm expression he had worn since the night she first arrived at his farmhouse. Nothing in his face suggested disappointment, excitement, or disbelief. He simply nodded once, as though her title had answered a question without changing the person standing before him. Lily looked from Claire to the executives and tilted her head with innocent curiosity. "So you have a really important job?" she asked. Claire smiled gently, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. "Yes," she answered softly. "But for the last few days, I have been much happier helping your dad organize paperwork." The little girl grinned proudly. He really needed the help. Even several members of the executive team smiled at the unexpected honesty. The gray-haired executive stepped forward again with measured respect. "Miss Whitmore, everyone at headquarters has been deeply concerned. The board postponed several major decisions because they refused to move forward until they knew you were safe. Thousands of employees have been asking for updates every day." Claire listened quietly before lowering her eyes toward the concrete floor of the garage. "I know," she replied. "I needed time to remember why any of it mattered." The executive nodded with understanding instead of criticism. "Your aircraft is waiting at the regional airport whenever you are ready." Ethan walked toward the coffee pot sitting on an old wooden table and poured several fresh cups without asking who wanted one. He carried them across the garage, handing a cup to each visitor as naturally as he would any customer who had stopped by for an oil change. The executives accepted the simple gesture with visible appreciation. One younger woman looked around the modest garage, noticing the neatly organized office, the family photographs hanging beside the calendar, and Lily's colorful drawings taped to the wall. "This place is beautiful," she said quietly. Ethan chuckled. "Most people usually call it old." Claire looked around the familiar space that had become unexpectedly precious within only a few days. "No," she said with quiet certainty. "Beautiful is the right word." As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the open garage floor, Claire asked if she could have a few minutes alone with Ethan and Lily before leaving. The executives respectfully stepped outside, giving them privacy beneath the wide Montana sky. Claire turned toward Ethan, holding the blue knitted blanket that Lily had insisted she keep around her shoulders. "I never intended to deceive you," she said. "When I arrived here, I was exhausted. Everywhere I went, people recognized my title before they saw me. For the first time in years, someone offered me a place to rest without asking what I could give in return." Ethan smiled gently. "You never owed us an explanation. You were simply someone who needed a warm meal and a safe place to sleep." Claire felt tears gathering, but quickly brushed them away with a quiet laugh. "Do you realize you're probably the only person in America who hears that someone leads a global company and responds by offering another bowl of chicken soup?" Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. "Everybody gets hungry sooner or later." Lily stepped forward and hugged Claire tightly before placing the folded blue blanket into her hands. "You should keep it until you come back," she whispered. Claire looked down at the blanket for a long moment before meeting Lily's eyes. "Then I promise I will return it myself." She walked slowly toward the waiting vehicles, but paused beside the passenger door and looked back one final time. Ethan stood beside the garage with one hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder, waving exactly as he would to any neighbor driving home after a repair. There was no awe, no expectation, and no attempt to impress her. In that quiet farewell, Claire realized she had finally met someone who measured a person's worth not by the size of a company, the balance of a bank account, or the influence of a title, but by the simple choices made when no one expected anything in return. And as the convoy disappeared down the winding Montana road, she understood that leaving the farmhouse would be far easier than leaving behind the life it had quietly awakened within her. The return to Chicago was as polished as ever, yet everything looked different through Claire's eyes. The private aircraft landed before sunrise. A waiting motorcade carried her through quiet streets lined with glass towers, and by 8 o'clock she was seated once again at the head of the executive conference table overlooking the city skyline. Digital reports filled enormous display screens. Financial projections stretched across. Polished oak tables and department leaders discussed acquisitions, expansion strategies, and quarterly performance with flawless precision. Only a week earlier, Claire would have responded with the same sharp focus that had earned her reputation as one of the most respected business leaders in the country. Instead, she found herself staring through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward the distant morning sunlight, remembering a small garage where success had been measured by repaired trucks, honest handshakes, and a little girl proudly serving homemade pancakes. "Miss Whitmore," the chief financial officer asked politely, "would you like us to continue with the proposal?" Claire blinked softly before offering an apologetic smile. "Please continue." She listened carefully, but every impressive chart seemed strangely incomplete. Every discussion about growth reminded her of Ethan refusing to charge an elderly rancher for repairs that could safely wait another month. Every conversation about customer retention reminded her that Ethan remembered every person's name without needing a database. When the meeting ended, Claire remained alone in the conference room long after everyone else had left. The city below continued moving with relentless speed while silence slowly settled around her. She opened a desk drawer and carefully unfolded the familiar blue knitted blanket Lily had insisted she keep until they met again. Running her fingers gently across its worn stitches, she realized that the most valuable thing she had brought back from Montana could never appear on a balance sheet. That afternoon, Claire requested a special meeting with her executive leadership team. They entered expecting another discussion about corporate strategy. Instead, Claire stood before them with unusual calm. "For years," she began, "we have measured success by numbers. Those numbers matter, but they do not tell the entire story. Behind every small business is a family. Behind every family is someone working quietly every day with dignity that deserves respect." The room became completely silent. She continued, "Today I want our company to begin investing in those people." Over the following weeks, Whitmore Global Industries announced the creation of the Second Chance Initiative, a nationwide program providing grants, business education, modern equipment, and emergency support for independently owned repair shops, family farms, neighborhood diners, and other small businesses that form the backbone of communities across America. Reporters praised the program. Industry experts called it visionary, and community leaders welcomed opportunities that had never existed before. Yet whenever journalists asked Claire what had inspired such a dramatic change in direction, she simply smiled and answered, "Someone reminded me what leadership looks like when nobody is watching." She never revealed Ethan's name, never mentioned the farmhouse, and never spoke publicly about the quiet days she had spent in Montana. Some stories belong to gratitude rather than publicity. Meanwhile, life in Ashford continued almost exactly as before. Ethan repaired engines, greeted customers by name, and spent every evening helping Lily with homework before they shared dinner at the old wooden kitchen table. Occasionally, Lily would glance toward the coat hook where the blue blanket usually rested and ask, "Do you think she remembers her promise?" Ethan smiled gently every time. People who keep their word do not forget promises like that. One cool autumn evening, while closing the garage after another ordinary day, Ethan noticed a neatly addressed envelope resting inside his mailbox. There was no company logo on the front, only his name written in graceful handwriting. Inside rested a simple handwritten note that read, "Some places teach success. Others teach what success is for. Thank you for showing me the difference." Folded beneath the letter was a newspaper article announcing the nationwide launch of the Second Chance Initiative. Ethan quietly read the article beneath the warm porch light, smiled to himself, and looked toward the peaceful Montana horizon, never imagining that this quiet beginning was only the first chapter of a promise that was already leading Claire back home. Autumn quietly gave way to the first signs of winter across the Montana mountains, and life at the farmhouse continued with the peaceful rhythm Ethan had always treasured. Frost settled gently across the fields each morning. The old garage welcomed familiar customers before sunrise, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with motor oil as naturally as ever. Lily had started counting the weeks since Claire's departure by marking small stars on the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. She never asked whether Claire would become famous again or whether she would appear on television. She asked only one simple question every few days. "Do you think today might be the day she comes back?" Ethan always smiled before answering. The best promises are worth waiting for. Hundreds of miles away, Claire continued leading Whitmore Global Industries with renewed purpose. The Second Chance Initiative expanded into dozens of states, helping family-owned businesses modernize equipment, survive difficult seasons, and create new opportunities for local communities. Every speech she delivered sounded different from the ones she had given before arriving in Montana. She spoke less about corporate achievement and more about trust, character, and the quiet dignity of ordinary people whose names rarely appeared in headlines. Yet after every successful meeting, every ribbon-cutting ceremony, and every standing ovation, she returned to her office, opened the same desk drawer, and looked at the carefully folded blue knitted blanket waiting inside. It reminded her that the greatest investment she had ever received had cost nothing more than an open front door, a bowl of homemade soup, and the kindness of strangers who never asked for recognition. One Friday afternoon, after concluding another board meeting, Claire quietly informed her executive assistant that she would be taking the weekend away from the city. There were no reporters, no security convoy, and no corporate schedule waiting for her destination. She chose to drive herself, leaving behind tailored business jackets in exchange for a simple wool sweater, blue jeans, and the familiar beige coat she had worn on the night everything had changed. Resting carefully on the passenger seat beside her was the neatly folded blue blanket. The drive across Montana felt strangely comforting. Endless pine forests, winding country roads, weathered barns, and snow-dusted fences welcomed her like old friends. As the sun slowly began setting behind the mountains, the familiar farmhouse finally appeared at the end of the gravel driveway, exactly as she remembered it. The porch light glowed warmly against the growing evening shadows, and the garage door remained open while Ethan finished replacing a set of tires before closing for the day. Lily happened to glance toward the driveway first. She froze for only a second before running across the yard with joyful excitement. "Dad!" she shouted with a smile that seemed brighter than the sunset itself. She kept her promise. Ethan looked up from his workbench just as Claire stepped out of the vehicle, carrying the carefully folded blue blanket in both hands. She walked toward the porch with a quiet smile that needed no introduction. "I believe this belongs here," she said softly as she handed the blanket back to Lily. The little girl hugged it tightly before wrapping it around both herself and Claire exactly as she had on that first stormy night. Ethan stood watching them with gentle appreciation before asking the only question that truly mattered. "Did you have a safe trip?" Claire nodded. "Yes," she answered. "I think I finally know where I was traveling all along." The evening settled peacefully around them as the three walked together toward the farmhouse, the porch light glowing against the cool mountain air. Claire had returned without cameras, without executives, and without the symbols of extraordinary wealth. She came back simply as the woman who had once needed shelter, and as Ethan opened the front door once again, she realized that some places never stop feeling like home because they were built not from wood and stone alone, but from kindness that quietly waited for those willing to find their way back. Winter settled gently across the Montana Valley, covering the fields with a quiet blanket of snow that reflected the soft morning light. Weeks turned into months, yet the peaceful rhythm of the farmhouse remained unchanged in all the ways that truly mattered. Ethan continued repairing trucks before sunrise, greeting every customer with the same steady handshake and honest advice that had built his reputation over many years. Lily continued filling the house with laughter, school projects, and endless questions that somehow made every dinner conversation feel important. Claire no longer appeared only as an occasional visitor. She returned whenever her responsibilities allowed, arriving not with a convoy of luxury vehicles, but in the same modest sport utility vehicle she had driven back on her own. She helped prepare breakfast, answered telephones at the garage whenever business became busy, and laughed with Lily while organizing community food drives for families throughout the county. Before long, the people of Ashford stopped seeing her as an important executive from Chicago. They simply knew her as Claire, the woman who never hesitated to lend a hand whenever someone needed one. Early one spring morning, Claire invited Ethan to join her for coffee on the farmhouse porch before the garage opened. The snow had almost disappeared, leaving fresh green grass beneath the towering pine trees while birds welcomed another Montana sunrise. Claire placed a simple folder on the small wooden table between them. "I would like you to look at something," she said quietly. Ethan opened the folder and found several pages describing a new advisory council for the Second Chance Initiative. The program had already helped thousands of independently owned businesses across the country, but Claire wanted its future decisions guided by people who understood small communities from personal experience rather than corporate offices. Ethan slowly closed the folder before looking at her. "Claire, I have never managed a corporation." She smiled warmly. "Exactly. You have managed something much more difficult. You have built trust one person at a time." Ethan remained silent for a moment before softly laughing. "You still have a way of making ordinary things sound important." Claire gently shook her head. "Because they are important." Lily stepped onto the porch, carrying 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate even, though the morning had already warmed enough for coffee. "I figured important conversations should have important drinks," she announced proudly. The three laughed together, and the quiet sound echoed across the peaceful valley. Ethan finally looked back at the folder and nodded. "I will help, but only if we never forget why the program exists." Claire's expression brightened with quiet gratitude. "That is exactly why I asked you." In the years that followed, the Second Chance Initiative continued growing across America, but every major decision began with one simple question that Ethan insisted everyone remember. Will this help real families live with greater dignity? The question became the heart of the entire organization, shaping countless opportunities for hardworking people whose stories might otherwise have remained unnoticed. Yet despite every national success, the most meaningful moments always happened back at the little farmhouse in Montana, where the garage still smelled of fresh coffee and motor oil, where where homemade chicken soup still welcomed unexpected guests, and where a blue knitted blanket remained folded across the living room chair, no longer a symbol of shelter alone, but of a promise faithfully kept. One quiet evening, as the golden light of sunset spread across the mountains, Ethan, Claire, and Lily stood together on the familiar porch watching the breeze move gently through the pine trees. No one hurried to speak because some moments were too complete for many words. Claire reached for Ethan's hand, and he gently returned the gesture with the same quiet confidence that had first welcomed a stranger on a stormy night. Lily smiled as she wrapped the blue blanket loosely around all three of them, laughing that it had finally become large enough for everyone. The porch lights slowly came on as evening settled over the valley, and in that peaceful silence there were no titles to defend, no fortunes to prove, and no applause to earn. There was only gratitude, quiet dignity, second chances, and the simple truth that the greatest miracles often begin when one ordinary person chooses kindness before asking questions, leaving the world forever. Changed by a door that was opened with compassion instead of fear.